Hey guys, and welcome back to our discussion of civil rights. Um, just want to make sure that I clarify something. When we talk about civil rights, what we're talking about is the equal opportunity, right? That's the key here. It's equal opportunity, that everybody should have the same opportunities to be successful and to succeed and to use their talents and abilities like everyone else in this country. It's making sure that we understand what that means exactly, okay? So where we left off, we were talking about the Supreme Court case of Brown versus the Board of Education and the huge impact that it has. Now, of course, it didn't happen overnight. It took a long time. But we'll talk about that court case at the end of this thing. We're going to actually look at the Supreme Court case of Brown versus the Board of Education and make sure you get that information down in your Supreme Court documents. Okay. What we want to look at today is basically just continuing on looking at the civil rights movement, especially in the 1950s and the 1960s, where they realized they had a couple of really strong tools that they could use to their advantage. One was litigation, like Brown versus the Board of Education. Litigation means taking it to court, right? Challenging some of the laws and rules and policies that exist, and arguing that they were unconstitutional. The other thing that they had was legislation, passing brand new legislations that would improve their options and their choices and their chances. One of the best ways to get new legislation passed was by basically getting the people behind them, by basically reaching out to the public and making contact with the public and getting the public opinion behind them also. Okay, that's why you see a lot of the protests and marches and things along those lines. So the civil rights movement, one of the big key pieces of legislation they got passed was in 1964, and that was the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And what that did is it got passed and it made racial discrimination illegal in regards to renting a hotel or a motel room, making segregation illegal in restaurants, and probably most important the key aspect of this is it made discrimination illegal for jobs, where before 1964, you could literally say to somebody, we're not going to hire you, you're black, right? After 1964, that became illegal to discriminate against somebody because of their race for a job, for getting a hotel room, or where they had to eat in a restaurant. It was illegal. Doesn't mean it didn't happen, but it was illegal. All right. We also had a lot of push for voting rights, moving towards voting. Remember that word suffrage that some of you struggled with in our first exam. Suffrage means voting. We have a number of constitutional amendments that are targeted towards voting and voting specifically, including the 15th Amendment, which basically gave African Americans, in that case, African American males at that time, the right to vote. That was 1870, I believe, is when that was passed. So 1865, we basically get rid of slavery, the Civil War is over with, and then 5 years later, we give African American males the right to vote in 1870. It won't be another 50 years before we give women the right to vote, but we gave African American males the right to vote in 1870. But even though they had the right to vote, it didn't mean we made it easy for them to vote, especially those southern states. Many of them did everything in their power, including illegal power, to try to keep blacks from voting, including things like a poll tax, where you would charge people a small, charge people a small tax in order for them to vote. Or they had what was called white primaries, where the only people who were allowed to vote in primaries were white people. And honestly, if you can't pick who is in the election, who's going to actually be on the ballot for the election, primaries are kind of even more important and more significant sometimes than the actual election itself. Ask Bernie supporters, right? Those white primaries were eventually ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1944. So another thing that they did in southern states is they used intimidations, they used murder, they used lynching, they used threat and violence. The rise of the Ku Klux Klan occurred in the 1920s and again in the 1950s. All these different things, including also we actually in many states had what they called literacy tests, where they would say, well, you can't vote if you can't read, so they would require you to take a literacy test. And then it was just really simple. If you were black, there was no way you were going to pass this literacy test. And if you were white, you wouldn't even have to bother taking it. You would automatically pass. What I'll do is I'll throw in our Google Classroom an example of a literacy test from this time period. and we'll let you see how you would do on that literacy test. This is a little spoiler for you. You're going to fail it, okay? All right. Voting also basically continued on in the 24th Amendment, which got rid of things like the poll tax and the literacy tests that were required for federal elections. The state of Florida is dealing with this right now. The state of Florida, basically up until recently, did not allow people who were convicted felons to vote, and they recently passed, thanks to it was voted on by the people in the state of Florida. They gave the rights back to felons to vote, but then there were still people trying to stop felons from voting if they served their time and they were out, but maybe they still owed, some money for court costs, or they still hadn't paid a fine off and stuff like that. And they were basically saying that unless you have 100% of it, everything is paid off, and you don't owe any money, kind of thing, you can't vote unless you have that done. And a federal court just ruled that that was unconstitutional. That felons, even if they basically serve their time, even if they owe money for the felony that they committed, they still are allowed to vote. That you can't deny them that right to vote. That's most likely going to get appealed, and we'll see what happens if the Supreme Court wants to listen to it or not. One of the other big key components of the civil rights movement was the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This was designed to try to help stop all of those barriers that these southern states were trying to put up to keep African Americans voting. And what it really stated was, it said, look, these southern states, you have a history of trying to keep black people from voting. So what we're going to do is we're going to put restrictions on what you can do. You're still in charge of elections, but if you are going to change anything regarding elections or how they're proceeded, or who gets to vote, or how you vote, it has to go through the United States Congress first, okay? That's what it basically stated. So that was in place in 1965, and we saw the number of African Americans voting in southern states significantly increase after that. Now, just recently, a couple of years ago, the Supreme Court basically ruled, you know what, that was 1965, that was a long time ago, we have a black president, look what's happened and our world's changed. And they basically stated that specific aspect of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that required the southern states to get approval from the United States Congress if they wanted to change any of their voting habits, that was unconstitutional, and they threw that out. And then what we saw quickly after they did that was a rash of states, including the state of Wisconsin, that passed things like voter ID laws that requires you to have an ID with you when you vote. And I know for many of you sitting there in our suburb are thinking, well, how hard is that? Who doesn't have a driver's license? And the answer is lots of people, millions of people. And many people who live in inner cities where they don't need a driver's license because they've never owned a car, or many people who are minorities or who are poor, oftentimes don't have driver's license. They don't have that ID. And even when states will say, well, we'll let you go to a DMV and pick up an ID whenever you want, and we won't even charge you for it. It sounds good on paper, but in real life, it's not very practical. If you're basically working, paycheck by paycheck, you're living paycheck by paycheck, how are you going to take off of work to try to make it to the DMV in that short window of hours that they are open? Or what we saw is more and more DMVs got shut down in areas where we'd see the most need for people to go and get those IDs. It's just not an easy thing for people to do. It's a barrier, and there's going to be some legal arguments about whether or not it's unconstitutional stuff. So far, the Supreme Court in most of these cases have upheld voter ID laws, but that can change. We'll see. What I want to do is I want to take a second here. We're going to kind of stop for today. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put onto our Google Classroom one of those literacy tests from the state of Louisiana. I want you to take a look at it. Obviously, you don't actually have to do it. You can try it, but I guarantee you that you fail, because it's written so that I can make sure that you fail, okay? What I also want to do is I want to take a look at a John Oliver video that I'm going to post on our classroom that takes a look at the idea of voter ID and whether or not it's unconstitutional and whether or not it basically is designed to keep people from voting. It's clearly makes it more difficult for people to vote when we have more hurdles put in place. The argument from the other side will be that it's designed to keep the integrity of the votes, to make sure that people aren't doing fraudulent voting and stuff like that. And John Oliver will deal with that issue also. All right. Do me a favor. I actually want you to watch the John Oliver video I'm going to post it right alongside with this video. Okay. All right. You guys have a good day. Try that literacy test. Let me know if you have any questions. By the way, don't forget, we're planning on taking the exam for this unit on Monday. All right. We'll talk to you guys later. Be safe. Wash your hands.